Alrighty, so we're here today. We're doing my coilovers on my 2011 Mitsubishi Evolution. I'm going to go through the process and then show you guys all the tools you need, and hopefully it'll be helpful. Alright, so we've already done the front left coilover, and we're going to demonstrate on the front right coilover. We're putting on BC BR series. I got them about last week. We're taking off T7 coilovers that are just completely worn out. Alright, so now we're going to start taking the old coil off of the front right side, and we will demonstrate how to do that. First, what you're going to want to do is take off the brake line bracket. That's going to be a 12mm bolt in the back of it attaches to the back of your coilover there. You're going to need a 12mm socket with a ratchet. We got that. And then up top, you're going to need a 14mm socket to take off the three bolts here that hold the top of your coilover on. And then back down here, you're going to need a 19mm socket to get these two bolts, the strut bolts, off. There's two of those, one down here. So the first thing you're going to start with removing your old suspension or coilovers is you're going to want to remove the brake line bracket from the back of the coilover. It's just connected to a stud with a nut on it. So now we will remove the brake line bracket. Alright, we're trying to get the brake line bracket off of the back of the coilover. So that's going to be on the back side. We can't really show you that, and that will be a 12mm socket. That's just one bolt that comes off, and then you can move the brake lines out of the way to pull the coilover out. Alright, so the next step is going to be to loosen the nuts where the coilover connects to the spindle, like the bottom of the strut. So there's two 19mm bolts and nuts that connect that coilover to the spindle, I guess you would call it. And we'll be using a impact drill, or whatever you want to call it, with a 19mm socket. You could also do just a 19mm socket and a regular ratchet, but they should be very tight, so that might be difficult. Alright, so now we're just removing the nut from those bolts. Like I said, it's a 19mm socket, and we're using an impact wrench, drill, whatever it's called. So when you remove those two bolts, you're going to want to have the hub and rotor supported with something. In this case, we're just using a small jack.
So we're going to use the impact socket with the impact wrench to try to screw the bolt out. Goes.
It's going to do the same thing, try and hammer that bottom bolt out as well.
Make sure you use a brass hammer to avoid stripping the threads or messing up the threads if you hit the threads with a smaller hammer. There it is. Can you still see it?
Try and twist it.
That easy.
Alright, so now that we've disconnected the brake line bracket and got those two bolts out from the spindle, we can just move the coilover around a little bit.
There's still this clip right here.
Oh, that?
No. I'll show you.
Alrighty, so now the coilover is completely loose at the bottom there, and all we have is the 3 bolts at the top holding it on from the top. Alright, so now that everything is loose at the bottom, we are going to loosen these 3 bolts that hold the top of the coilover in place. And that's just a 14mm socket.
You do need a deep well for one of them. This one right here, you're gonna have to use a shallow socket for. This one is the one you have to use the deep well for.
And you might want to have somebody, since the bottom of the coilover is completely loose, you might want to have somebody hold the bottom of the coilover so it doesn't just drop on the ground. Because those 3 bolts are the only thing holding it in place when you get those bottom bolts out.
So, a shallow socket. This one back here.
Alright, so now that we've removed all 3 top bolts and all the bottom bolts, including the brake line bracket, the coilover will just pull right out. Alright, so now we are going to put the new coilover in. The first step with this is going to be getting the coilover up there and then sticking it through the top of the thing and just hand tightening those 3 nuts so it stays in place.
Now that he moved the coilover up, we're going to put on the new bolts, or nuts.
Just snug them up so the coilover stays in place. You got your new coilover just hanging there. Alright, so now what we're going to do is just connect the brake line bracket to the back of the stud in the coilover. You just line it up and then put the nut, screw the nut on there. This is pretty simple.
It's easier to do this now where you can move things around than it is later when it's stuck in place.
So you just kind of want to line it up the best you can. It can be a little tricky because you can't see anything back there. Alright, now once you get it lined up, you can just put that nut on there and tighten it up with your 12mm socket. Alright, now that that's snug, you can continue to line it up with that, and then slip your 2 big bolts through. It's kind of a pain to line up.
Alright, right here, we're going to go ahead and stick the pin in.
So you just want to line those holes up the best you can. It's pretty easy if you have the jack supporting it. You can move it around.
You could also use one of these alignment tools right here. It would also help.
So they should just slide in pretty easily. And then just make sure there's a little groove here. You want to make sure that's lined up correctly. And it should just slide right in. And the next thing you want to do is tighten down the nuts on them. And remember, there is a top and bottom bolt.
We're showing the top one being that's the only one you can see in the video.
Alrighty.
Same formula for both bolts.
Yeah, the bottom bolt's a little harder to get to, but alrighty, so now when you have both nuts hand tight, you can just get your impact drill or a 19mm socket. I think I can probably get it.
Alright, you're going to use a backup wrench, which is the one on the left, to hold the bolt.
Now both of those are tight and our new coilover's in. We're going to want to go back up top and secure those 3 nuts at the top. So now everything's secure at the bottom, you want to come back up top and make sure these 3 nuts are super tight. And once again, that's just a 14mm socket. Alrighty, and now that those 3 nuts are secure, that's it for installing new front coilovers.
And I'm gonna tap it to break it loose. Now my top nut's turning, so I'm gonna have to use my backup wrench to hold my top nut from turning. And I got the 2 nuts loose. Now I'm just gonna lower. I'm gonna lower it and I'm gonna measure my gap to get it the same. Which I had 1.5 inches on the other side. Come down a little bit further.
So as far as adjusting the coilovers go, I already had coilovers on here. We're just replacing them because they were shot. We're just doing them the same height as my old coilovers. So we just measured from the old ones, doing the same thing on the new ones.
So I got the bottom jam nut to the height that I want it, so I'm going to run the top nut down to it. And once I get it a little loose, I should be able to run it by hand like that. And once it hits it, then I'm going to tighten the 2 bolts back up. So I'm using the big wrench on the top and just running my jam nut back hard against it. And that's it. That should have 1.5 inch gap. I'll double check it, which is 1.5 inches.
Alright, so now that we've got both of the new coilovers on the front, we're going to throw the wheels back on and jack up the rear and show you guys how to do the rears.